Nora, Dahlia here, and Emily Barth Eisler. Just real quick, I wanted to announce that Zibby's Bookshop is hosting a fundraiser for some of the schools in the Palisades who ended up losing their libraries. So anything that you guys could donate would obviously be really appreciated, or if you can even just spread the word, you can go to zibbymedia.com, and we're going to help all these 4 schools, libraries, rebuild everything. So we're very excited about that. Okay, now I'll get into it. Nora Dahlia is a style writer whose work has appeared in prestigious publications such as the New York Times, Elle, Vanity Fair, to name a few. In addition to being branded a content expert, book doctor, ghostwriter, and writing coach, she resides in Brooklyn with her husband, 2 kids, and their large cat, Waldo. The picture is her debut romance novel. Yay!
Thank you.
And Emily Barth Eisler is an award-winning author known for her middle grade novels, including Aftermath, The Color of Sound, and her upcoming picture book, Always Enough Love, set for spring of 2026. She's a passionate advocate for gun control, and she has contributed exclusively to outlets like Publisher Weekly, Today.com, and she also writes about sustainability, eco-friendly skincare for magazines like Oprah Daily and Allure. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you for having us. Thank you all so much for being here. It was just so exciting to see everybody come in and see, especially Nora's face light up at so many friends and family members here. It's so nice. So I'm Emily. I'm so excited and honored to be doing this. Nora and I met 7-8 years ago because we were sort of matched in a writer's group together in Brooklyn, where I used to live and where Nora still lives. And now I live here. We traded places. Mm-hmm. But Nora is still the first person I call when anything writing comes up, or the first person I want to read my work, the first person I want to gut check anything with. And so being here with you for this is like an incredible honor. And I would not have made it into publishing or through the last several years without you.
I feel the same way.
It's very exciting. I hope y'all don't mind. We're just going to catch up. And because we don't get to see each other very much. So we're just going to chat. And it's so nice that you're here. No, I'm kidding.
No, but it is so special that we're doing this, to get to do it with an actual friend.
Yes.
And not just an actual friend, but an actual friend who's a writing friend.
It is a really special bond because I feel like with you, we have a lot in common. We have a lot of similarities, and then we have a lot of ways in which we're different. And there's a shorthand that I don't have with everyone in the world of writing, freelancing, being a mom. We both have older daughter, younger son, kid combinations. And there's just so much that in reading, I reread Pickup over the past 2 days on audiobook and just listened to it and to enjoy it again and make sure I wanted to write down every other line and basically just read you a list of all the lines I loved, but
that would have been so good.
I know.
I would have totally done that.
But you guys should just read the book and also get the audiobook and listen to it. So good. I was telling Nora before we started, and she encouraged me to share this with all of you. I think I read the first draft of this book. Would that have been winter 2022? Or would it have been earlier?
No, I think that's right.
Okay, so winter 2022. I remember it was winter break. I was in Colorado visiting my brother-in-law, sharing a room with my husband and 2 kids, and it was lights out at 8:30. And I was like, "Oh, Nora sent me a book," and I pulled it out and I just read the whole thing on my phone in a night because it was so good, and I couldn't stop, and I didn't want to stop, and I emailed Nora right away and was like, this is good. Everything you write is good. And I think one of the fun things about being in a writer's group together, one of the fun / heartbreaking things is that I've read stuff of yours that hasn't gotten published, that hasn't been bought, and it's criminal. And it makes me so sad. I still think about the Remorse Tour and a few other things you've written that I can't believe aren't out there, and maybe someday they will be. But this one I read and I was like, okay, not only is this really good, and I read a lot of romance. I write for kids, but I read romance.
For grown-ups.
Yeah, I don't know if like, well, I have a hard time, and I don't know if you do, but I have a hard time reading within my own genre while I'm working on a book.
Yes.
Like I don't want to read middle grade while I'm writing middle grade because I'm worried I'll borrow from,
Totally.
without meaning to.
It's like contagious.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I exclusively read romance while I'm writing for children. It works. Don't worry about it. Please, no comments. It's fine. So I read a lot of romance. And I read this and I was like, no offense to everybody else. I was like, this is better than anything else I've read. And I just remember over the course of the next couple of years, they were like, well, I don't know, trying to send it out. And I was like, you have to keep doing this. This is so good. And I still feel that way. It's been through rewrites and drafts and it's just keeps getting better. And I continue to love it. And I'm so excited. But I remember reading it in the dark in 2022, just being like, this is so, it's not just good. It's also, I feel very seen in it. It's very you, it's very well observed, but it's also very universal. And it's like what would be going on inside my brain if I were as witty as you are. And I think
very kind. As you can see, Emily's like my like most enthusiastic like writing friend. Like she's always so supportive and amazing.
But it's only because you deserve it. I'm not like this with everyone. You guys should come back and see me talk to other people. It's not for everyone. Okay, so for anybody here who hasn't read the book yet, can you give us a brief description just so they know what we're talking about?
Yeah, I'm bad at this. And also, I just want to say, over the years, I've done a lot of events like this. And over the last few weeks in particular, I've done a lot of events like this. And I am so overwhelmed right now. Like, I almost feel like I'm going to start crying.
You can. We'll talk through it. It's fine. It's fine.
Being here with all of you and all of you showing up and so many people that I love and I like don't get to see, it just means so much to me. So thank you so much for all showing up. And hopefully we will not be boring. This book, Pickup, is about two divorced parents who meet in and around school, pick up and drop off. And they keep having sort of negative interactions in which mostly the male main character keeps getting in the way of the female main character. And it is what in romance is considered an enemies to lovers trope story, in which they then sort of meander to a Caribbean island because it's romance and so they can.
It really works. It's very organic.
Oh, thank you.
How did you get the idea? I mean, I know obviously you do a lot of pickups and drop-offs, but was there sort of a crystallizing moment where you're like, this is the next book I'm writing?
Yeah, there was like very much a crystallizing moment. I was standing outside my kid's school after drop-off one morning with a circle of friends, parent friends who I like. And
Not always.
Not always, right. And who often linger after drop off, like this particular crew. And we were talking about how our school had like a real dearth of salacious gossip, that there was just like no interesting anything going on at the school between the parents. So we hear all this gossip about like 321, which is another part of school, like the parents and the
it's like
affairs
there.
and the stuff, and nothing.
Wow.
And I was like, but it's so weird because it's like, it feels so like rife for that. It's all these people like sort of forced into meeting each other and all this stuff. And then I was like, I'm going to write a romance and it's going to be called Pickup. And because it was like school pickup and then obviously the double meaning with like picking someone up. And actually my husband was like, I don't think it's that good an idea. I don't even in this crowd need to say my husband, Andrew. And I was like, well, I'm doing it anyway. And so I did.
And it's, well, I'm going to get to that later. So you mentioned the enemies to lovers trope. For those of you who don't read romance, you all read romance, right? Everybody reads romance. But anyway, there are a lot of different there are a lot of tropes that are sort of universal. Forced proximity, only one bed, enemies
like,
to lovers.
There's a snowstorm and we're stuck at a hotel. There's one room and oh no, there's only one bed.
It's a really good one. It's a really good one. But enemies to lovers, is that your favorite trope or is that just the trope that worked best for this story?
Well, as most of you know, like Nora Dahlia, I'll just say from the beginning, is not, that's my first and middle name, not my last name. And that's because I have historically written upmarket commercial fiction under the name Nora Zelavansky. So in this case, I've switched, but even though my other books weren't romances, there's still always a romantic through line in them. And it's always enemies to lovers, I feel like. At least I think so. Yeah. Yes. And I think that's because it's my favorite to watch and to read. And I feel like that kind of dates back to my mom reading me Pride and Prejudice at a pretty young age. And the Mr. Darcy of it all.
It's a good one.
It sticks.
Yeah.
And then it's sort of the When Harry Met Sally of it all, which I guess you could sort of argue is enemies to friends to lovers.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that I write that because it's what I want to read.
Yeah. One of the things that I loved about this book is that it touched upon being in the sandwich generation, which is something I really relate to. And actually that The Color of Sound also touches on in a different way, but this idea of being a mother and a daughter at the same time. Can you talk a little bit about, like, I don't know how much you want to reveal or get into it, but like you are at that stage of life in your own life. Did you borrow pieces from your own life, or were you sort of using that as a jumping off point? And
yeah, I mean, I won't give away like that part of the plot necessarily, but I do like to joke that I have no imagination, and it's only like a little bit of a joke. Because I do tend to really write from my personal experience. Not that the characters are me or people I know, because that's actually not the case, and they're usually just like amalgamations. But my locations are locations I know. The issues that come up are issues I'm grappling with. And so in this case, she is dealing with like an issue that comes up also with her mom. At like a health issue. I promise it's still not that much of a downer. But while she's also trying to take care of her kids, basically alone, because her husband, her ex-husband actually lives like in LA all the way across the country.
People who live in LA.
The worst. They're just the worst.
So gross.
And so I definitely pulled from my own experience in that sense, and just watching my friends around me kind of try to struggle to juggle like parenting in a time that's really chaotic and insane, where expectations are just unrealistic and we're not actually capable of meeting them, and yet it feels like everyone around you is doing a better job of meeting them than you are. And then on top of that, sort of navigating your parents getting older and trying to figure out like how to be available to all the things.
Yes, and one thing you wrote about in this book really beautifully that I felt deeply was the sort of fallacy of being a freelance mother. And maybe this applies to fathers as well, but I mean, obviously I can only speak to my own experience, but the fallacy of having a flexible schedule is even more pressure. I think I have friends who have 9 to 9 jobs, and it's very clear and easy. They're like, I cannot make cupcakes for my kids' school because I will be at the office from 9 to whenever. But I think for those of us who have quote unquote flexible schedules, there's a pressure we put on ourselves, perhaps. Like, well, I do work from home. I could make the cupcakes. I could also do the laundry. I could also, and it's never ending. And I felt that so deeply.
I mean, I feel that's definitely something that I grapple with a lot. And it's funny because when I started to write this book, I told my sister that I was going to write a straight romance, and straight, like only a romance, not in terms of sexual preference. And she and Emily are actually like my first 2 readers generally. So I sent her the book, like the first draft as well. And she was like, well, you Nora'd it. And I was like, well, what does that mean? She was like, you set out to write a romance and then you made it about like gender politics and like the mental load. And I was like, well, sorry, but that's what was on my mind.
But I feel like, I don't know. I mean, I think that's what gives it beautiful depth, and gives it realness. Like, I love reading romance, but I don't want it to be inconsequential. I want people to be like fighting the patriarchy along the way and falling in love, because
Yeah.
you have to be able to do both.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it bears mentioning, since like a lot of you probably aren't romance readers, that in general, as we all know, the romance as a genre is generally like not taken very seriously, and there's multiple reasons for that. You know, one of which is that I think the books come out a lot. The readers are really voracious, and the books come out much more quickly than other books.
Yeah.
And so maybe,
Which only means that people hold romance writers to a higher standard to write well and fast and frequently, but we'll talk about that later.
But so I think
And they're mostly
that,
women, and they're usually moms. Okay.
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so I think that there's a sense that maybe at a certain point there wasn't as much focus on like craft and structure. Maybe that at some point was true, but it's certainly not true now. But what's really interesting, and that I didn't realize until I sort of joined this romance crew, which is very different than the rest of the book world and is almost like Comic-Con in its vibe, versus like what the rest of the literary
Well, yeah, like
world
people
feels
are
like.
creating universes in the same way that they are Marvel or
And
you
it's
know.
like and the readers they really know the canon, they're really like educated in romance. But one of the really, really interesting things that I learned is that because romances come out quickly, they are able to comment on the culture and what's in the zeitgeist in the way that other books can't. Because
So true.
normally you write a book and it comes out like 3 years later. In this case, if you're an active romance writer, you're writing a book a year, which means that your books are reflective of what's actually happening. And so that's, I think, part of it. I was able to sort of talk about those issues, actually what you touched on, which I've always felt very explicitly, because I have always been freelance and self-employed, which has always made me feel like, yeah, technically I am available. Like no one's stopping me from baking the cupcakes,
Right.
except for the fact that I fucking hate baking and cooking. But also, if I do that, no one's working. Like I'm not working. And that's always been like a challenging
Yeah, and the
challenging thing.
pressure, you do a really beautiful job in the book of, I don't want to spoil anything, but sort of painting the pros and cons of the different styles of parenting and what each of the people has to offer and is able to give, and how they're able to do that. There are some parents in the book who are there every morning selling sweatshirts. And I always look at those parents and think, oh, I am not that mom. And it's taken a really long time. My older kid's about to be 14, and I'm finally making peace with like, you know what? I'm not the mom who sells the sweatshirts.
Yeah.
And I don't wear the sweatshirts. It's just, I don't know. Like I never felt that passionate about
There's elementary school.
Yeah. But it's taken me a really long time to be like, and that's okay. There are other things I do. There are other ways that I contribute. There are other weird volunteer things that I do, but I think there's a pressure to do the most obvious and visible, or like whatever our own parents did when we were kids.
Yeah.
To be that mom out there every morning, to be
My mom, to be clear, was not that mom.
Oh,
either.
see, mine was.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that is just like so perfect in the book, and I'm curious if you lifted these word for word or if you made them your own, but like all the emails that come home from school about crazy sock day and, you know, crazy hat day and all that. And you guys, I don't know how I won the lottery, but my children, neither of them wants to ever participate in those days. And I think either I spoiled the fun by like telling them how conformity is, you know, bad for society and blah, blah, blah. Or maybe they just aren't that kind of people. And I feel like I won the lottery because I can ignore that. Like it was wear red day the other day. And I was like, sorry, kids. And they were like, I don't care.
That is lucky. We were
It is
walking
so
to school
lucky.
not long ago, and in front of us, like by a few feet, was a girl with a Coke bottle taped to her head. And we were like, what? I was with my two kids, and we were like, what the hell is happening right now? Like, what is wrong with that child? I was like, do you know that kid? Like, does that kid have like problems? Like, I was like, what's going on? And then like the closer and closer we got to school, the more like people we saw in various, and then we realized it was like crazy hat day.
Yeah.
And I was like, sorry.
This is us. I feel like every other Friday is pajama day at my kids' school, but my kids go to two different schools. And so I don't know whose pajama day we are at. And I always get to school like with my son and the rest of his class is wearing pajamas. And I'm like, oh no, do you want me to run home and get you pajamas?
You're like, I mean,
I'm like,
do
I totally
have
could because I'm a freelance mom. I totally could. And thank God he's like, I would never wear pajamas to school. I'm like, that is such a relief. So, you know,
Yeah.
thank goodness for small favors. But there's so many other details that you pull out that I was a Brooklyn mom for a couple of, my daughter went to school up kindergarten, first and second grade in Brooklyn before we moved to LA. So it feels so spot on perfect. But the thing I love about it is it's also universal because I also recognize all of the characters and all of the school pressure from my school here in LA. So I'm like your test audience where I'm like, yes, this resonates as a Brooklyn mom. It also resonates as an LA mom.
That's good because actually what I realized, and I hadn't realized previously, was that because I grew up in Manhattan and then I'm raising children in Brooklyn, is that in places where you drive, like the drop off and pickup is in cars. And so you actually aren't convening in that way.
Oh, but it's like cool to park far away and walk
and like go hang out.
Walk so that you can get that experience.
That's the thing. Okay.
But it is different. You know, you're not schlepping. I remember in Brooklyn schlepping my tiny children and younger one in the stroller like almost a mile to school.
Yeah.
I don't miss that.
No. Over like snowbanks that are like brown and gray and yellow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys need your own podcast.
Okay. Sounds great.
I don't even have kids and it's entertaining.
Well, that's really nice. So one thing that you included in this book that I also personally appreciated, but on a more global perspective, want to thank you for, is the mention of the character's Jewish identity without being a ginormous part of the plot, but it's definitely part of the book, and it's what I like to call part of it is what I like to call incidental Judaism, where it's just like, it's not a big deal. It's like, she just happens to be Jewish. Well, when I was growing up reading books, it was like the default assumption was white, Christian, cis het, all the stuff. And thank goodness now that is not the sort of blanket expectation. And so I really appreciated that the main character is Jewish. And then it does become a slightly larger plot point at one point, which I'm not going to spoil. Was that something that was hard for you to decide, or did you get pushback on that? Was that discussed?
That's interesting. So, well, first of all, going back to the having no imagination, my characters are always Jewish.
Well, you have to write what you know. I'm like, how would I write a non-Jewish character?
Yeah,
I don't know what that,
and it's always like very obvious based on their last names.
Yeah, me too.
But like, sort of, that's it. In this case, though, what Emily's alluding to, which I will just say because it's not a huge
I don't know how much you want to.
And also, it's just kind of interesting. There's like a small instance of anti-Semitism in the book, which I wrote like long before things became so intense and we all know what we're talking about. And so when we went to edit the book, my editor and I did have a conversation in which she asked, like, do you want to introduce this topic in like, because even though it's such like a lightning rod topic,
and
right
it's also just so real. Like, it happens casually and constantly in my experience.
Yeah,
things like this that mention, and then the character's decision of like, do I want to make a big deal out of this
or not?
Am I going to say something?
So we talked about it, and she was like, and really the real question was, this is a romance,
right?
Do you want to like introduce sort of something that feels stressful to people into this? And ultimately, I just felt like, I can't cut this. Like, I would feel like disloyal. And the truth is, again, because you can be reflective of the culture in a certain way, and because there was a rise in anti-Semitism even before everything erupted, it felt like true to the time. And so that's, so.
And I appreciate it. And I think, as you were talking in the beginning about how romance has changed, but also how society's perception of what a romance book should be and has changed. One thing I appreciate about romance books is they do usually tackle some social issues in a way that doesn't feel performative or preachy or forced. They acknowledge that part of falling in love and being in love and working on that stuff is also dealing with the nonsense of the world around. And I think to leave that out, to omit that, would take away some of the reality of
Yeah, I think that's
the
true.
book. And
I mean,
I'm glad you wanted to keep that in. I'm glad it.
yeah, I'm glad
stayed.
I did too. Although I have to acknowledge, like, it's not like sexy particularly, but it but
Well,
it is.
I don't know. I think
real,
being an
I guess.
ally, I mean, she has support from her new friends and
Mhm.
her love interest, and I think that's sexy. Like
Yeah.
being an ally is cool. So you're modeling very good behavior, and that's important too.
Yeah.
You
Okay,
know?
I'll
Yeah.
take it.
I know we want to save time for questions from you all. How are we on time? I'll do one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience if anybody wants to ask anything. Oh, now I have to choose my favorite question. Okay, so
Make it a fun one. No, I don't know. That was pressure. Just do whatever.
I was actually going to choose a more serious.
Okay, go
question.
serious. I'm ready.
Well, I was just going to say I loved your use of multiple POVs because
Oh.
you were able to do something, and I don't know how you kept track of everything so beautifully of who knew what at what point, which I think is really hard to do. And there were some secrets that you managed to not spoil from other perspectives. Did you have like a serial killer note cards with string board? How did you utilize those perspectives? I mean, I loved it because you made each character so sympathetic.
Oh, good.
And you sort of gave us a little window into why people do the things they do, some good, some bad. But how did you keep track of who knew what at what point and not spoil anything?
I mean, I want to say luck. I I don't outline at all.
Okay, this is how we're different.
Yeah.
I love an outline.
Outlining like makes me I get bored writing when I outline. So it just means that my drafts often are messy, like the early drafts, and they really need like heavy editing, and I need to make sure I've added things in. And but what Emily's alluding to is that in this story, there are 3 points of view, which is sort of unusual for a romance, right? It would normally be one, or like maybe each of the romantic characters would have one.
Right.
In this case, there's a third point of view, and she's almost like a voyeur.
But she gives us some really important perspective and information.
Yeah. And I tend to always have like a little bit of a twist in my books, like randomly, sort of an unexpected something that ends up happening. Maybe it sort of is a nod to my love of mystery. Like I have spent a lot of my life like reading mysteries, but in this case, it was really that so I grew up in New York, as most of you know. And then I came here for a long time. And then I went back to New York, but I moved to Brooklyn, and I kept in touch with my like friends that I grew up with, but I had this whole nother life that was completely disconnected from my upbringing. And then a mom came to my kid's school who went to my high school.
Oh, wow. So
And
this really, you really don't have any imagination.
no, really, I don't.
All right.
Except she's lovely.
Okay.
Except I like her and she's lovely.
Okay.
And it's, yeah. But I had a moment of like a clash where like she met one of like a new friend of mine and was describing like what I was like in high school. And she was
my nightmare.
And she was being complimentary, which was nice.
Well, that's good, but still.
But still, I was just like, oh, this is so weird. Like her perception of me then, like, is it sort of what's her perception of me now? And it just really got me thinking about the way that we see each other, the different versions of ourselves that we are throughout our lives. And
even if they're all good, it's a lot to hold.
Yeah,
to
and
be
they
all
can't be all good, to be honest, right?
Yeah.
And also the way that people see us versus the way we see ourselves. Like I feel like sometimes I walk around like Park Slope or Windsor Terrace, my neighborhood, and I'll walk past some like gorgeous brownstone and like the lights are on and I can see like some amazing light fixture and it looks so cozy. And I'm like, those people are living their best life. And then I'm like, you don't know that.
Yeah.
You know? And so I just got really obsessed with this idea of like people's perception of us versus the way we see ourselves versus the way we actually are. And like, what is the truth?
I love that. And you did a really good job of letting that gently unfold in the book and letting us draw our own conclusions. And then also offering some other perspectives of like, no, it may look like this, but it's not that. I appreciated that. because you brought up all of the ways in which we are told that we have to show up, and as parents, as children, as partners, as ex-partners, as all of the things, and you offered also a voyeur kind of perspective. And then well, I'm not going to give anything away. You all have to buy the book and read it. And I think we're going to take some questions from the audience now. If anybody wants questions, comments, anything, otherwise we will keep talking. No problem.
First off.
Thank you.
I have one.
Oh, great.
Yeah, do it. Do start it off.
Please, thank you. Nora, you're both so entertaining. I bit my tongue and I said, I'm not going to say this should be a podcast. And now I love you. That's exactly what this is. The vibe, the energy, the spirit support is perfect. Like perfect live audience. So thank you for you. I love Andrew. Andrew is my hero. Andrew's amazing. But Nora is the capo di tutti capi. Nora is the icing on the cake. Nora's the cherry on top. And so it's so good to see you.
So good to see you too.
I can't wait to, I don't think I've read a romance novel in a minute.
Ever.
Ever seems so extreme.
It does.
Because I don't remember.
I'm just not imagining you with like the
Right.
Jude Devereaux and the Danielle Steele.
Right. But now I'm excited, especially because Andrew like poo-pooed it the first time anyway. What was he thinking?
He did. Interestingly, though, I will say this is that I wonder if he's going to be like, why would you expose it? But anyway, there is an ex-husband in the book and he lives in LA and he is a filmmaker. And as I said, I write about what I know. So that's why I picked that career, because I like know what it is. And I didn't really even think about it. And then the first time I met with my editor in person, she was like, tell me about your life. And I told her about my husband. And she was like, oh, so he didn't mind that you made the ex-husband like and gave him like his job. And I was like, oh, like I didn't even occur to me. And so I came home and I was like, you want to hear something funny? And I told Andrew and he was like, yeah, it kind of bothered me a little bit.
Aww.
And I was like, why didn't you tell me? Like I would have switched it. And he was like, the book was really good and I didn't want to ruin it.
Oh, that's really nice.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the questions I didn't get to on my list of what is it like to write about a divorced couple when you are happily married and making it work? Like, are people stopping you and being like, I loved your book. Is everything okay? Like, what is that like?
I know. Well, you hope, especially in a romance, because you have to also write the like spicy parts, that people are able to separate the characters from you. Otherwise, you just want to die.
Yeah.
But I definitely had to research. Like I researched the way that just so that it would be authentic, the way that like you would for anything in a book. So I talked to like my divorced friends, had conversations with them about like how it worked, how they felt, like the various different sort of elements of being divorced. Yeah. And then I was like, tell me about the hot man you're looking for, because I'll write him.
You're writing a main character. Yes. And have your kids read any parts of the book, or do you imagine I mean, not the...
I am sure that Estella has like snuck and been
Yeah,
like...
I would imagine that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, they haven't read this one.
Yeah.
I think like some of my earlier books would be a better
Just they'll start
beginning.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This may be not so appropriate.
Yeah. Any other audience questions, comments, thoughts?
You know, it's not your questions, but I just want to say I give you guys such credit and kudos for everything that we're talking about. As a working mom, or as a non-working mom, or whatever, we all contribute to the collective story, right? And it helps each other, even if you have guilt about making crappy cupcakes or not making any cupcakes, or maybe you're making a lot of cupcakes but you're not, doing this other thing that you, like, you can never do everything the way you want to do it. Like we all want to be perfect with everything, right? And there's always so much time.
Yeah.
And so, it's just really nice to hear you guys talk about it, but also give yourselves extra. I mean, I'm older, my kids are now married, and I looking back, it's like, oh, keep myself up constantly. You know, I'm like, I was contributing in a way that I didn't even realize, right?
Yeah.
You just are by showing up and doing. It's all there.
Well, thank you. I mean, Emily asked about how the inception of the idea, and the story I told is accurate, but also, as the sort of bio mentioned, like I spend a lot of my time ghostwriting and collaborating on books also. And for the 2 years leading up to like the two primary like COVID years, I was working on multiple projects, but the two most primary ones were, there was one that was about sexual assault, and there was one that was about a Holocaust memoir. And so it was dark and it was COVID, and I was like really having trouble writing my own stuff. And in that time, I have a really close friend, mom friend, who is a very successful historical romance author. And I started reading her books, and it was like the only thing I could read during COVID. I know a lot of our reading habits changed over COVID because we could, like, people who read a lot
And even I
stopped
think
reading.
leading into that, like I got into romance during the first Trump administration, because before that I used to listen to podcasts, and suddenly all podcasts were just odious, and I needed escape.
Yeah, exactly. So
I think
that's
these
actually,
past-
and that's totally where I was going, which is that when I sat down after that like stretch of writing such heavy stuff, I was like, I'm going to write what I want to read, and I'm going to write something that helps us escape. And that also goes for like escaping like the pressures of everyday life as a parent, and work and whatever else is going on in the world. Just a chance to read something that takes you sort of away from all that, and that will have a happy ending, because that is the one rule of romance, is there has to be a happily ever after. And yesterday I was just talking to someone, and we were talking about how like a happy ending is a form of resistance, because it's the choice to feel joy. And
Amen.
and as a woman, like because these tend to be in that sort of perspective, to choose to be empowered, to have that hope and like that happiness,
Yeah.
How old are your children?
Mine are 7 and 11, and I have an older girl and a younger boy, as does this main character. But they're a little younger because it was a few years ago. Yeah.
So I see that you dedicated this one to Claudia, and
That's my sister, for
Yes.
anyone who doesn't know.
and it made me kind of wonder. So I wonder this about authors and screenwriters and playwrights. I guess part of it is just that possible pressure of like, oh, are people gonna think that it's them and these
Right.
characters? But even beyond that, like when you dedicate a book to somebody, is there also a bit of that, like, oh, but are my parents gonna feel like, why were
Right.
they? But I did my mom in the last one, so I'm gonna do. Or is there just a moment of clarity that you have as you're working on it, or as it's in the editing phase, or something where you're like, somebody in particular inspired something, and so all along that they're gonna be the dedicate. Like I'm actually
That's a
very
really
curious
good
about
question.
that.
No one's
That is a
ever
great
asked me that, and I
question.
love that question. First of all, I need to tell you a very brief story, which is
Okay.
that at my New York launch event, my sister came early with me. Of course she did, because she was like, I'm coming early to make sure everything's okay. She's my big sister in like every
And to make
sense of
sure
the word.
you're okay.
Yes, exactly. And she was like, what do you need? What's happening? Do they have it under control? If not, I have it under control. And she went to like get her sign in or whatever. And they were like, would you like to buy a copy of the book to get it dedicated by the author? And she was like, I am the dedication.
That's great.
You would appreciate.
Can't wait to call her out.
I love writing the dedications. I think it's like so. For me, there's always been a really obvious person that I want to dedicate each book to, and
like obvious while you're writing, or obvious once it's kind of close to
It's a
being
good
finished?
question.
Afterwards,
Oh,
like
okay.
when I'm like, oh man, I need to write my, usually like you've written the book, you've handed it in, and then suddenly you're like, oh my God, I haven't written a dedication or acknowledgements. When is that due? And they're like, oh, in 3 days.
Yeah.
Did we not mention? I mean, does that happen to you every time?
Yes, I just turned in the dedication for my next book, and while I was writing it, thought I knew who I was going to dedicate it to, and then when the moment came, I
Oh,
was
you
like,
switched it.
oh no. Well, okay, so I have 2 picture books coming out next year. One is about
So Emily writes middle grade, but she also writes like children's.
yes, and so the book that's coming out first is a Holocaust story about my husband's grandmother, with whom I was very close, and her journey from Germany to America. And actually, Nora edited the author's note for me because I was like, I give up, I can't. But when it came time for the dedication, I was going to dedicate that one to my daughter, and then the other picture book to my son. But the other picture book is a very light and fun and sort of silly rhyming picture book. And my husband was like, are you worried that the kids are going to be like, okay, so you dedicated like the heavy Holocaust one to one kid and the funny, silly, but I was like, yeah, you're right. Like you have to consider all of those things, and it's hard.
Yeah, you do
So
have to think
I
about
changed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I feel like I generally like hand in the book, don't really think about it. And then when they're like, you need to write your acknowledgement, I almost instantly am like, this one's for this person. And like Claude, she just, like I said, she's basically like my first reader. She's literally all day long. Like, I'm like, what's the word I can't think of for blah, blah, blah. And she's like, blah, blah, blah. And then like 3 hours later, I'm like, what's the whatever.
So why didn't you dedicate any of your first 3 or 4 books to her?
I guess
why
it
did
didn't-
it take so long?
I know. Good question.
Yeah. No, I'm teasing, but it's
No,
it's
but
a
it
great
is a good
question.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just like what feels.
Andrew's one of them, right?
Well, Andrew, I dedicated. So my first book I dedicated to my parents
Right.
because they're my parents. And also, yeah, and because I sort of credit my mom, especially with teaching me to write. And so that felt appropriate. And then the second book that I wrote is kind of, it's again, so going back to the No Imagination, it's kind of like a very loose version of our story. So I had to dedicate it to Andrew. I mean, there was no question.
I mean, you're on Orlando Street.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then the third book was inspired by having lost like a friend. And so it was obviously going to be dedicated to him. And then, yeah, I mean, it was time for Claude. And also she like reads romance more than some other people I know. And I don't know, I just felt like it just felt right.
Have you thought of any of your books crossing over into movies?
Yes. No, I mean, that's sort of the dream. That's what you hope. And my Competitive Grieving, which is the book I wrote before this, is sort of in development in that way. There's like a screenplay for it, and it's out in the world. And now this book is being taken out into the world to see if anyone's interested, and if everyone would just like pray for that to be the case, I would appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, that would be fantastic.
Did you write the screenplay of Competitive Grieving, or did someone else?
Someone else did. I tried to adapt my first book as a screenplay, where there were producers who optioned it and they gave me the chance. And I thought I was like so proud of myself when I did it. And because I was like, I'm cutting this chapter and this chapter and I'm not being precious and and I sent it to them and they were like, that's so great. Let's cut half of the book. And I wasn't even upset about it. I just realized that I was like way too close to it to be able to do that for myself.
It's hard.
I just couldn't. The thing is, the parts of books that authors, I mean, this is a huge generalization. I'll just speak for myself. The part of books that I write that I love the most are never the parts that other people care about. I think that for me, I mean, one day it would be nice to try and maybe with a little more distance succeed. But for me, that makes it really
I think
difficult.
it's also hard because you have such a picture of it in your head, and some of that comes out in the verbal description. But there's still a piece of it that the reader has to use their imagination. And then when somebody is going to make it a screenplay, they're dictating what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
And almost requires a third objective
Yeah.
person to,
You
to
know what
figure
else
it
I
out.
would say, and I don't. This isn't true for you because
Yeah.
you're the opposite of me in this way, actually. But also, I am not. My strength is not plot. Like I sometimes need Andrew help with plot.
Mm.
And screenplays are plot, like all plot largely. So I don't
Yeah.
necessarily know that that's. I don't want to like shut the door on that possibility, but I'm not sure it's my strength.
Yeah, well, maybe it's a team effort. It's something you would do with someone.
Yeah,
or,
want to
I mean,
write a
yes.
screenplay with me?
Sure. Yes. We are so. Oh my God, we've committed to a podcast, a screenplay. Like,
And I'm sorry, I'd like to object. I think you're incorrect about saying that your strength is not plot. I think you have great plots in your
Oh, thank you.
books. Have feel like they move.
I mean, I
Thank
agree,
you.
but I also know
I
it's
disagree
sort
with
of like what
I
part
appreciate
comes
that.
to you first. Like when you get an idea for a book, what part of it, like, do you envision the characters first or the situation first or like some visual? Because I will just get like a flash of a scene in my head and be like, okay, I have to write around that.
I mean, this is so weird to say, and I never thought that I would like say this or it would be true, but my last 2 books were inspired by the title. It's so weird. Like I thought of the title first, and that actually.
Well, that's a really cool way to do it.
It's weird though, but
it's
unusual.
but it works.
Yeah.
It's really good.
But I would say I have a very, like, as I said, I don't outline. So I have a loose idea of what's going to happen. And as I go, like I'll be writing and I'll stop for the day and I will make a note about what's going to happen next so that I don't, when I come back to it, I'm not like, wait, now what? You know, I have like something to build on. So I guess I'm kind of plotting as I go.
I think that's one of the hard things about being a writer and any other job, whether it's being a parent or having all writers have other jobs. And I always say that's a good thing because that's where your best ideas come from. When I do school visits and talk to kids and say it's not a bad thing that you need a day job, but it does make it hard to, I always say my first book, Aftermath, I think if I'd had uninterrupted time and didn't need to eat, sleep, or nurse my newborn, I think I could have written it in about 48 hours.
Right.
But I didn't have, it was all in there and I was like, I got to get it out. But then I had 2 small children,
Right.
one of whom was a newborn. So I think part of what's such an interesting challenge is having to stop for the day.
Yeah.
But I think it's also good for us because I find my brain does some of the work while I'm not thinking
Yeah.
about it. Again, the pros and cons of needing to have other jobs are like, that's where the ideas come from.
I would agree with that. And actually often in these kind of settings, people will ask like, do you have a very particular like writing schedule or like particular things you need in order to write? And I'm like,
nice.
I did before I had kids.
Right.
Like I used to feel like I had to write first thing in the morning and I had to have like a certain drink next to me and a certain crystal. Right. I don't know. I still like crystals, but now I've written chapters on literally written chapters on my phone in the car while the kids are asleep in the back seat and Andrew's driving, like, because you have an idea and that's where you are and necessity calls for
yes,
it.
exactly. And I think, speaking for you and for me, I think our writing has only gotten better and more interesting and more rich for its interruptions and its non-continuousness. But that's just life, you know. That's how the magic gets made. And I always say, is it the Bronte sisters who were like total seclusion and still wrote really interesting social commentary? Do I have that right?
That sounds accurate.
Like,
yes.
These days, you heard it here, you guys. That's what our podcast is called. We are totally correct. We don't fact check.
There's not going to be a fact check.
I think it was the Bronte sisters who lived, never left the house and yet wrote these really interesting social commentaries. Other than that, nobody does that.
Yeah, I don't think Jane Austen was out and about very much.
Maybe that's
either,
who I'm thinking of. Yeah, but I think the ideas come from the interruptions in the other parts of our lives and we can't write in a vacuum because how would you get, crazy sock day?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, but if that is true, how do you prevent those interruptions from distracting you to the point where you never get anything written?
That is the question.
Yeah.
Yes.
I the answer to that is, everyone has a different answer to that, but the answer is that no matter how scary coming back to that blank page is, or whatever version of a blank page is, that you have to write through it. like right through the fear, right through when you're writing something and it's coming out shitty. I wrote my first book doing National Novel Writing Month. I don't know if any of you know what that is, but basically you're meant to write 1,700 words a day for like a month, and then at the end you have a novel. You're not allowed to go back. You're not allowed to you're not allowed to research. You're not allowed to whatever. And that actually really works for me because I like to say I write from a place of deep anxiety. It's better for me to just like get it all out.
Really? I mean, yeah.
And just have like a very shitty draft and then go back into it. So for me, at least, that stopped me from getting in the way, because when as I said, I'm a book coach also. And what gets in the way, people have great ideas for books, but what most often gets in the way of them actually completing the books is that at some point in the process, and this happens to all of us, they decide that the idea is terrible, the writing is terrible, the entire thing is trash, and why did they do this in the first place? And then they stop. So, I mean, the only trick to writing a book is not stopping.
Yes, because going through that moment where you're like, this is terrible, is part of the process. If you don't go through that, then you need to like think about maybe it actually
then you're
is
wrong.
terrible.
It is terrible.
Right.
Maybe that's
Right. I think worrying about it being terrible is what prevents it from being terrible. So you
Yeah.
have to have that moment, but it's the keeping going.
It's the keeping going.
Yeah.
Claire.
I got here a minute late, so maybe you already talked about your pen name.
No, I didn't. Good question. I mean, I referenced the fact that I'm writing this with a different name, but there's kind of interesting reasons for that. Like two of them are maybe slightly less interesting, which is just that in romance, this is something that historically people do. Like they keep their first name, they make up a last name. I like mined my family for last names. Like it was all like Edelberg. It wasn't like sexy romance name.
Great.
I think Edelberg is very sexy.
But and then I thought about using like a character, like a literary character, and it just felt so posery and like trying hard. And so ultimately I was like, I'll just drop my last name. And my sister was like, that's not a name. Like Nora Dahlia is not a name. Dahlia is not a name. And then by the end of the conversation, she was like, I think it works. So we were just like, it was fine. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is that it allowed me to start fresh as this kind of author. So it wasn't like, it was less confusing. It wasn't like, you used to write commercial fiction and now you're writing romance. It was like a very distinct sort of line. But the most interesting reason is that the marketing department at Simon & Schuster was like, have you ever noticed, because my last name, I mean, I think everyone in this room knows this, but since my last name starts with a Z and is Zelavansky, they said, have you ever noticed that when you go to a bookstore, your books are always on the floor? And I was like, yes, but it never occurred to me like to think about, but it's true. Every time I go to see if like a bookstore has my books, I'm like down here being like, where is the Z's? And so they were like, maybe pick a last name that's at eye level. And and this is really interesting also because this goes to this idea that like the romance world is a part of the literary world that feels completely different than everything else. It turns out that romance authors often pick last names that start with the same letter as another author who writes a similar genre, like trope, but who is much more successful, so that they will be like slotted next to them, and so that readers will be like, I will buy this Emily Henry and like this like Sally Hurwitz or whatever it is, you know.
That's amazing.
And so that's actually a thing.
So who are
That's
you next
crazy.
to?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, this won't mean anything to anybody unless they're a romance reader. But I noticed I was at the airport at BWI and coming here, and I found my book at like the Hudson News, and it was next to Sophie Cousins.
Oh, that's good. That's good real estate. Also, can we talk about how I think having your book at an airport is like the ultimate, like you've made it, you've done it. And I just, congratulations. Like that's what It's
It's so
incredible.
funny.
That's where people buy. Bookstores too. But
Well,
like
it's just like
airports.
having
Yeah,
people
it's
trapped
amazing.
with so many less options. It's like
It's
really
amazing.
helpful. No, that it's funny that is like the pinnacle, but I was so excited
No,
when
but
I
the
found that out.
alphabetical thing, like my husband wanted me to change this title, The Color of Sound, to A Color of Sound, because my first book was called Aftermath. And so it was chosen as one of the 100 best children's books of the year. And it was number one because it
was
started with
A.
an A. And so at that time, I was finishing up this book, and my husband was like, A Color of Sound?
Oh,
Yeah,
smart.
huh?
See?
But I was like, no, it doesn't. No, it's it doesn't work. But like, there's so much weird strategy that goes
There
into
is.
marketing a book, and all of these things that you think maybe don't matter. I don't know if they do. I don't know if it makes a
I don't
difference, but
know.
I like your placement next to Sophie Cousins. That's
Yeah,
great.
and the airport
Yeah.
thing is great. I would say that the other thing that I'm just waiting to have happen, which is hard to do, like have happen in this day and age, is I'm just waiting to be on the subway and see somebody reading my book.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
The problem
I've
is
had
everyone's on nobody's reading a book.
No. Well, it's more with children's books, because I have had someone send me a picture of someone reading my book.
I have had one picture,
And
as
the
well, but-
ultimate happened to me at High Holy Day services. We sat down in a pew.
We're
I don't
doing a
think
real
I've told you
Jewish
this.
theme here.
We talk what we know.
It's happening.
My family went to Yom Kippur daytime services, and we sat down in a pew, and I turned around, and the person behind us was like a 12 or 13-year-old girl, and she was reading a book, and I did a double take, and she was reading this book. And I was like, wow. And we're not like that involved in the synagogue such that she was reading it because she knew I went there. Like, I
It
wish
was an
we were those
accident.
people, but we're not. It was not because like the synagogue is not pushing my book. They should, but they're not.
I mean, my daughter, they should. My
should.
daughter read this book and was like obsessed with
Well,
it.
I appreciate that
Yeah.
so much. But yes, it is. I think the thrill of the subway sighting, the airport bookstore, the
These are
Yom
good
Kippur
things.
services. She brought it up
The
to the
movie and
Torah.
TV show.
Yeah, like. Yeah, there are a lot of milestones, and the goalposts keep moving, but I hope that you feel tremendously proud and successful with this book, because it is a delight. I've now read it like 4 times, and every time I read it, I get something new out of it. And I think I said this to you before, I feel very seen by it. And I think writing something that is fun and entertaining and escapism, but also still, if we have one job as authors, I think it is to make readers feel seen. And it is to make them feel like they're not alone, like their experience matters, like their feelings are valid, and you are validating feelings, even from somebody who is also happily married, not divorced. Like, I was able to read this book and see so much of my life in it. So thank you
I'm
for
so
writing
glad.
it. Thank you for
Thank you.
making us all feel so seen.
Thank you so much. That was awesome and hilarious. And we have plenty of books to buy, and I think they'll stay here and sign. So.
And I know that Nora's books are not for school libraries necessarily, but if anybody wants to contribute a book to a school library, you were talking earlier about repopulating libraries of schools that burned down. If you want to get a copy of my book, and I'll sign it, and we'll make sure it gets to some school libraries, I will personally make sure it gets there. That's a really beautiful, important thing we can do right now. So
Thank you. Thank you guys so much.
I mean, I would love to have your book in a school library too.
A college library, maybe.
Yeah, I feel like maybe,
Yeah.